The first sound I heard that morning was not my alarm, or the old furnace coughing awake under the floorboards, but a steel post being driven into my front yard like someone was planting a flag on land they had already stolen. I opened my eyes to the sharp clang of metal, the low growl of a work truck idling by the curb, and the wet smell of fresh paint drifting through the cracked bedroom window. For a second, I thought one of the county crews had the wrong address. Then I stepped onto the porch in my socks and saw the sign. Bright white board. Red letters. Gold HOA seal. Future Maple Ridge Community Heritage Center. Right there in the middle of my grass, 6 feet from the stone path my father laid by hand in 1981. Behind it stood Vivian Hartwell, president of the Maple Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, wrapped in a cream-colored coat that looked too clean for a muddy yard, one hand around a paper coffee cup, the other holding a folder thick enough to ruin a man's week. 2 contractors were measuring my porch with a tape reel. 3 neighbors stood across the street pretending not to stare. Vivian smiled like she had practiced it in a mirror. "Ethan," she said, soft as a church whisper, the neighbors voted. "You have 30 days to leave." I remember the cold of the porch boards through my socks. I remember the smell of cedar dust still clinging to my hands from the cabinet job I had finished the night before. I remember looking past her at the sign and noticing the little printed map at the bottom, the one showing the project boundary. They had drawn my house inside the HOA property line. Not beside it. Not near it. Inside it. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and I am not a lawyer, a politician, or some rich guy with a lake house and a private gate. I am a carpenter. I fix old windows, rebuild rotten stairs, and know the difference between real wood and expensive garbage dressed up for a sales brochure. That house behind me was not pretty by Maple Ridge standards. The paint was tired. The porch sagged half an inch on the left. The mailbox leaned whenever the ground froze. But my father died in that house. My mother planted the white oak out front when I was 6. Every scratch in the kitchen floor had a story, and every story had our name on it. Vivian did not see any of that. She saw cracked siding, an old pickup, and a piece of land her perfect little neighborhood wanted for something shinier. She tapped the folder against her palm and told me the vote was final. What she did not know was that 20 feet behind me, locked in a blue tin box under my father's workbench, was a deed old enough to make every signature in that folder worthless. I did not answer Vivian right away, because men like my father had raised me to measure twice before cutting once, and that morning felt like the kind of mistake that could take off a whole hand if I moved too fast. I stepped down from the porch, felt the wet grass soak through my socks, and walked straight to the sign while the contractors kept their eyes on the ground. Up close, the paint was still tacky. The red letters smelled sharp and chemical, mixed with diesel exhaust from the truck and the sweet rot of leaves piled along the curb. Future Community Heritage Center. That phrase almost made me laugh. They wanted to erase the only real heritage left on that street and replace it with a clubhouse full of framed photographs and donor plaques. My father, Samuel Caldwell, bought that farmhouse before Maple Ridge Estates had a name. Back then it was just county road, pasture fence, and 47 acres of hard dirt that turned gold in September. He was not a wealthy man. He framed houses during the week, repaired barns on Saturdays, and came home with sawdust in his hair and his lunchbox dented from job sites. In 1979, when developers came sniffing around with polished shoes and big promises, he sold off most of the acreage because my mother was sick and hospital bills do not care about pride. But he kept the farmhouse, the driveway, the white oak, and the narrow strip of land behind what later became the Maple Ridge Clubhouse. He always said he had kept enough ground for a man to stand on without asking permission. I did not understand what he meant until years later. When he passed, the house came to me with his old tools still hanging in the garage, each one outlined in black marker on a pegboard like he expected to walk back in and notice if anything was missing. The place had problems, sure. The gutters sagged after heavy rain. The porch steps complained under every boot. The upstairs hallway smelled like old pine and winter dust. But I had spent 8 months bringing it back one board at a time. New flashing over the kitchen window. Repaired railing. Fresh cedar stacked under a tarp. Every improvement paid for with calloused hands, not a committee budget. Vivian had hated it from the first week I moved back in. She stopped by wearing sunglasses big enough to hide a guilty conscience and told me Maple Ridge had evolved beyond rustic aesthetics. That was her favorite word for anything honest. Rustic. My truck was rustic. My porch was rustic. My father's fence was rustic. She said it the way other people say mildew. At first, it was just notices in the mailbox. Lawn maintenance warning. Exterior color concern. Unapproved work vehicle visible from the street. I answered each one with receipts, permits, and photographs. That only made her colder. By the time she stood in my yard with that folder, I could see this had never been about paint or property values. This was about control. She did not want my house fixed. She wanted it gone. Vivian's real talent was making a threat sound like a neighborhood improvement. She never raised her voice, never slammed a door, never gave anyone the satisfaction of seeing the gears move behind her eyes. She just smiled, printed everything on heavy cream paper, and let the Maple Ridge seal do the dirty work. The first official notice arrived 3 days after I refused to move the cedar boards from my driveway. I remember the envelope because it was too clean, too stiff, sitting in my mailbox like a summons from a country club. Exterior nuisance condition. Potential covenant breach. Community visual disruption. The words felt less like rules and more like a fishing net, wide enough to catch anything Vivian wanted. I called the management office and asked which covenant I had violated. The woman on the phone put me on hold for 12 minutes while soft piano music hissed through the speaker. When she came back, she said the board would discuss it at the next meeting. That meant Vivian would discuss it, because the board was just 3 retired men, 1 real estate agent, and whoever still had the energy to sit under fluorescent lights while she turned personal grudges into official minutes. By Friday, she had neighbors taking pictures of my porch from the sidewalk. By Monday, somebody had left a printed complaint under my windshield wiper claiming my work truck created a commercial atmosphere. That was Maple Ridge language for a man with tools. The air changed after that. People who used to wave from their lawns suddenly got very interested in their sprinklers. Garage doors closed faster when I drove by. At the mailbox cluster, conversations dropped into silence the second my boots hit the concrete. The only person who still looked me in the eye was Bob Langford, the old widower 2 houses down with a bad knee and a flagpole he polished every Memorial Day. One evening, while I was replacing a rotten baluster on the porch, Bob stopped at the edge of my driveway and stared at the white oak like it had personally disappointed him. He opened his mouth, then glanced toward Vivian's house on the corner. Her white Lexus was parked in the driveway, angled like a guard dog. Bob swallowed whatever he had been about to say and only muttered, "Your dad was careful with papers, Ethan. Real careful." Then he limped away before I could ask what that meant. The next week, the neighborhood concern meeting notice appeared on every door except mine. I only found out because a copy blew across my yard during a thunderstorm and stuck to my fence, the ink bleeding under the rain. There it was in black and white. Agenda Item 4, Caldwell Property Remediation Options. My stomach went tight, but not from fear. From recognition. I had seen enough rotten framing in old houses to know when the surface looked fine and the whole wall underneath was being eaten hollow. Vivian was not enforcing rules anymore. She was building a case, board vote by board vote, until my home looked like a problem that only she could solve. I went to that meeting with my father's old leather folder under my arm and the kind of calm that only comes when you are too angry to waste motion. The Maple Ridge Clubhouse sat at the end of Sweet Gum Lane, all brick columns, fake shutters, and a little bronze plaque bragging about community excellence. Inside, the air smelled like burnt coffee, lemon cleaner, and polished wood that had never known a splinter. They had set up folding chairs in neat rows, and every chair seemed to turn when I walked in. Conversations died one by one, like porch lights shutting off down a dark street. Vivian stood at the front beside a projector screen, wearing a navy blazer and that same smooth smile, the one that made everything cruel look procedural. Behind her, blown up 10 feet wide, was a photograph of my house. My porch. My truck. My cedar boards. Somebody had taken it from across the street, low enough to make the roofline look worse than it was. The room murmured like I had brought a bad smell in with me. I took a seat in the back, set the leather folder on my knees, and watched Vivian perform. She clicked through slides with words like blight, safety concern, deteriorating structure, and long-term risk to property values. She talked about protecting families, preserving investment, and honoring the character of Maple Ridge. Not once did she say my father's name. Not once did she mention that the house had been standing before her subdivision existed. When she finally looked at me, her voice softened into something almost pitying. Ethan has had many opportunities to cooperate with the community. Cooperate. That was another one of her words. It meant obey. I raised my hand, but she kept talking. The board members stared at their papers. Bob Langford sat near the aisle, both hands wrapped around his cane, his knuckles pale. When the floor opened for comments, a woman from Birchcourt said my truck made the neighborhood feel commercial. A man I had helped jumpstart his sedan 2 weeks earlier said the house created uncertainty. Someone else said children asked questions about why it looked different. That one stayed with me. Different had become dangerous. Old had become illegal. Mine had become theirs. I stood when they called my name. The chair legs scraped the floor louder than they should have. I opened the folder and held up my tax bill, my insurance papers, my county repair permits, and photographs of the work I had completed. Since when, I asked, keeping my voice level, can neighbors vote a man out of a house he owns? Vivian tilted her head like a teacher correcting a slow student. Since that man lives inside our HOA and refuses to meet community standards. Then she lifted a packet from the podium. A new subdivision boundary map, printed in color, with my farmhouse shaded pale yellow inside Maple Ridge jurisdiction. The room saw the color and believed it. They did not see the missing survey stamp. They did not see the crooked property line. They did not see Vivian's thumb covering the bottom corner of the page. 26 hands went up when she called for the vote. 26 neighbors chose my removal while I stood 10 feet away holding proof that I paid for every nail in that house. Vivian looked at me over the raised hands and smiled. That smile was the first thing I decided to save as evidence. The vote did not make a sound at first. Just hands in the air, sleeves sliding back, bracelets clicking softly, paper programs rustling against knees. Then Vivian tapped her pen on the podium and announced the result like she was calling bingo at a church fundraiser. Motion carries. 2 words, clean and polished, and somehow heavy enough to make the room feel smaller. She said I would receive formal notice within 48 hours, that the board would begin remediation proceedings, and that I had 30 days to vacate unless I submitted a written appeal to the same people who had just voted me out. I looked around that room and saw 26 faces suddenly fascinated by the carpet. Nobody wanted to watch the man they had just helped erase. Bob Langford did. He kept his eyes on me, his jaw working like he was chewing through an old regret, but he still said nothing. Outside, the night air hit cold and damp. The parking lot smelled like rain on asphalt and the fried onions from the diner across the county road. I sat in my truck with the engine off, listening to the ticking metal under the hood as it cooled. My hands were steady on the wheel. That bothered me more than shaking would have. There is a quiet place anger goes when it stops looking for a wall and starts looking for a file cabinet. The next morning, the first certified letter arrived. Then another. By lunch, I had 3 envelopes from Maple Ridge Estates and 1 from a law office in Fairview that apparently specialized in making bad ideas sound official. The thickest packet claimed my property had been declared a persistent covenant nuisance and subject to corrective transfer review. Corrective transfer. That was a fancy way of saying they wanted me out without saying the word steal. I called a local attorney whose billboard promised tough real estate defense. His office smelled like old coffee and printer toner. He flipped through the packet for 15 minutes, sighed through his nose, and told me fighting an HOA could get expensive fast. Sometimes, he said, tapping Vivian's color map, it is cheaper to negotiate a sale. Cheaper. My father had spent 30 years paying off that house with swollen hands and winter work boots. I was not going to price it like a used lawnmower because Vivian had access to a laminator. I left without hiring him. By Friday, the situation got louder. A deputy parked in front of my house just after sunset, followed by Vivian's Lexus and 2 board members in matching Maple Ridge fleece jackets. Sheriff Tom Reeves stepped out first, gray mustache, tired eyes, one hand resting on his belt like he already knew this was going to waste everyone's evening. Vivian walked beside him with a folder pressed to her chest. "This is the owner refusing lawful community action," she said. "Not Ethan. Not Mr. Caldwell. The owner, like I was a category on a form." I handed Sheriff Reeves my identification, tax bill, and insurance statement. Vivian handed him the new map and the vote record. He studied both under the porch light while moths battered themselves against the glass. Finally, he looked at me and said, "I am not removing anyone tonight. This is civil." Vivian's smile tightened, but only for a second. As they walked back to the cars, she leaned close enough for me to smell her perfume over the wet leaves. "Civil cases still end, Ethan," she whispered. I watched her taillights disappear down the street and realized she was right. They do end. Just not always the way bullies plan. That night, I did what I should have done before I answered a single notice. I went into my father's garage. The light over the workbench flickered twice before it caught, buzzing like a trapped insect, throwing long shadows over the pegboard where his tools still hung in their black marker outlines. The air smelled like motor oil, pine dust, and the faint tobacco scent that had lived in his flannel shirts no matter how many times my mother washed them. I pulled open drawers until the metal handles bit half-moons into my fingers. Old screws. Mason jars full of washers. Receipts from hardware stores that had closed before I learned to drive. Nothing. Then my phone rang. It was my sister Maggie, calling from 2 counties over, her voice tight with the kind of worry she tried to hide by sounding busy. She had heard from Bob Langford. That old man had finally found his courage, just not face to face. He had called her because he still had her number from my father's funeral. "Ethan," she said, "Dad kept a blue tin box under the lower shelf. He told me once it was for the house papers, but I thought he meant insurance." I crouched down, swept aside a stack of warped plywood, and there it was, pushed all the way against the concrete wall. A blue tin box, dull with age, speckled with rust around the corners, heavy enough to make my wrist dip when I dragged it out. The little brass lock was still on it. I found the key taped under the workbench in my father's handwriting, one word on the yellowed masking tape, Caldwell. My throat tightened before the lock even opened. Inside was not treasure, not cash, not some dramatic confession. It was paper. Old, folded, stubborn paper with courthouse stamps and surveyor seals and my father's careful notes in pencil. The smell that rose from it was dust, ink, and time. I spread everything across the workbench under that buzzing light. The original deed from 1979. A boundary survey drawn in blue ink. The sale agreement between my father and the developer who built Maple Ridge Estates. I read slowly, lips moving like a man learning a new language, until one paragraph made the whole garage go still. My father had sold the surrounding acreage, but he had carved out the farmhouse, the private driveway, the white oak, and a strip of land running behind the future clubhouse as excluded Caldwell property. Not community property. Not shared amenity land. Excluded. Then came the line Vivian should have feared. If any future association or neighborhood body attempted to impose covenants, control, access restrictions, or ownership claims against the Caldwell homestead, all granted easements over the retained Caldwell strip would terminate immediately and revert fully to the Caldwell owner. I read it again. Then a third time. The private lane behind the clubhouse, the Greenbelt Trail, the landscaped picnic area, and the land where Vivian wanted her heritage center were not gifts. They were privileges. Conditional privileges. And by voting to control my home, Vivian had just cut the rope holding them up. I slept about 20 minutes that night, maybe less. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's pencil marks crawling across that survey like little fence lines coming back to life. By sunrise, the kitchen table was covered in documents, coffee rings, and yellow sticky notes. The house was quiet except for the refrigerator hum and the slow tick of the wall clock my mother used to wind every Sunday. I had the deed on one side, Vivian's vote packet on the other, and between them sat the kind of silence that makes a man think very carefully before he moves. I called Claire Whitman at 8:13 that morning. Her name came from Maggie, who knew someone, which is how half of Real America still gets anything important done. Claire's office was above a bakery in downtown Fairview, and the stairwell smelled like cinnamon rolls and copier toner. She was not flashy. No marble desk, no wall of fake power photographs, just a woman in reading glasses with a red pen, a legal pad, and the calm expression of someone who had made arrogant people regret skipping the fine print. She read the deed once without speaking. Then she read the sale agreement. Then she pulled Vivian's new boundary map closer and let out a small laugh through her nose. "This map is not just wrong," she said. "It is useful." That word landed hard. Useful. I expected her to tell me we should fire back immediately, send a letter, march into court, shut the whole thing down before Vivian came back with another folder. Claire shook her head before I finished the thought. "No. Right now they have threatened you. We need them to confirm what they are doing in writing. We need the board vote. The project plan. The contractor instructions. Anything showing they knew they were claiming control over the homestead." She tapped the bottom corner of the HOA map, right where Vivian's thumb had covered the missing survey stamp at the meeting. "And we need the original version of this." So I did something harder than yelling. I waited. I answered nothing except through certified mail. I saved every envelope. I photographed every notice on the porch before touching it. I installed 2 more cameras, one facing the driveway, one aimed at the white oak and the new sign they had planted in my yard. The little red recording light glowed at night like a patient eye. Vivian mistook my silence for fear. That was her first real mistake. Within a week, she sent a formal relocation demand. Then a proposed access notice for preliminary site preparation. Then an email, forwarded to me by accident from the management office, where she wrote, "Once Caldwell is removed, we can finally move forward with the Heritage Center without obstruction." I printed that one on the thickest paper I owned. Bob Langford came by 2 evenings later, leaning on his cane, his breath fogging in the cold. He did not step onto the porch at first. He just stood by the driveway and looked ashamed. "Your dad made me witness something back in '79, he said. "I did not know it would matter this much." I brought him inside. The old house smelled like coffee and sawdust, and for the first time since Vivian put that sign in my yard, I felt the floor under my boots. Stop shaking. By the time Claire filed the preservation notice with the county, Vivian had signed 3 more documents proving exactly what she denied. She thought she was tightening a noose around my home. All she was doing was signing her name to the rope. The deadline was supposed to expire on a Thursday morning, which meant Vivian made her move Wednesday night. That was the pattern I had learned by then. People like her did not like daylight when the paperwork got thin. At 9:42, my driveway camera picked up headlights rolling slow past the white oak, then stopping near the service gate behind the garage. I was at the kitchen table with a mug of black coffee gone cold, Claire's preservation notice open beside my father's deed, when my phone buzzed. Motion detected. The screen showed Vivian's Lexus parked just outside the glow of the porch light, white paint shining through the mist like a bone underwater. Behind it sat a contractor truck with magnetic signs on the doors and a flatbed trailer carrying a small skid steer. The night air outside was damp enough to silver the grass, and through the old window glass I could hear the low rumble of the diesel engine, the clink of chains, the sharp beep of a truck backing up. Vivian stepped into frame wearing a quilted vest and bright red gloves, holding a clipboard like it was a court order. A man in a reflective jacket pointed at my back gate. She said something I could not hear at first, so I turned up the audio. The camera caught her voice clean and calm. This is approved site preparation. By tomorrow, this obstruction belongs to the association. Obstruction. She meant my garage. My lumber rack. My father's workbench wall. The place where the blue tin box had waited 30 years to save me. I felt my hand close around the coffee mug until the ceramic creaked softly, then I set it down. Anger wanted me outside. My boots were by the back door. My jacket hung on the peg. Every part of me wanted to walk into that floodlight and tell them to get off my land. But Claire's voice came back to me as clear as the courthouse bell downtown. Do not interrupt useful evidence. So I stood in the dark kitchen and watched Vivian become useful. The contractor cut the old chain with a portable grinder, not dramatic, not loud enough to wake half the block, just a hard metallic whine that sent orange sparks scattering into the wet gravel. The smell reached the house a second later, hot metal and cold mist. My camera caught the lock dropping into the mud. It caught Vivian stepping over it without looking down. It caught the contractor pushing the gate open against the weeds while the hinges complained like tired lungs. Then the skid steer rolled forward, its lights sweeping across the white oak, across the cedar boards, across the sign they had planted in my yard with the wrong boundary printed at the bottom. Vivian walked beside the machine and pointed toward the garage. Clear the rear access first, she said. The board wants the presentation area clean before the announcement. Presentation area. That was my backyard. The same patch of ground where my mother used to hang bedsheets in July because she liked how the sun made them smell. I took one photograph of the screen, then another. I saved the video twice, once to the cloud and once to a flash drive. At 10:19, Sheriff Reeves pulled up because Claire had already filed the notice and flagged the property. His cruiser lights did not flash. He just parked, stepped out under the mist, and asked Vivian one question the camera caught perfectly. Do you have a court order to enter this property tonight? For the first time since I had met her, Vivian had no polished answer ready. She looked at her clipboard, then at the open gate, then at the camera mounted under my eave. That little red recording light blinked back at her like a heartbeat. I stayed inside until the contractor loaded the skid steer back onto the trailer. I stayed inside while Sheriff Reeves photographed the cut chain, the tire marks, the sign, and the gate. I stayed inside because the deed was on the table, the evidence was saving itself, and Vivian had just walked past the last exit. The next morning, Maple Ridge called an emergency community meeting, and this time Vivian made sure I received the notice. It arrived by hand at 7:30, delivered by a board member who would not meet my eyes. The paper smelled like toner and panic. By 10, the clubhouse parking lot was full. Same brick columns. Same bronze plaque. Same burnt coffee smell hanging in the air, only now nobody was laughing near the refreshment table. Vivian stood at the podium with her hair fixed, her blazer pressed, and her face carrying that stiff calm people wear when they are trying to pretend the floor is not cracking under them. Behind her, on the projector screen, was the rendering for the new Heritage Center. White siding, black shutters, stone walkway, little benches under my mother's white oak like they had already buried the truth and landscaped over it. I walked in with Claire Whitman on my right, Sheriff Reeves behind us, and Bob Langford moving slow on his cane but standing taller than I had ever seen him. The room went quiet in a way I could feel in my teeth. Vivian tried to start first. She said the board had acted in good faith. She said emotions had run high. She said unauthorized accusations were damaging community trust. Claire let her talk. That was the thing about Claire. She never interrupted a person who was helping her. When Vivian finally took a breath, Claire placed my father's deed on the front table inside a clear plastic sleeve. The paper looked small under the fluorescent lights, yellowed at the edges, almost fragile. But every person in that room leaned toward it like it had its own gravity. Claire explained the carve-out. The farmhouse. The private driveway. The white oak. The retained strip behind the clubhouse. Then she read the reversion clause slowly, each word landing clean. Any attempt by a future association to impose covenants, access restrictions, control, or ownership claims against the Caldwell homestead would terminate all granted easements over the retained Caldwell strip. Bob raised his hand before Vivian could object. His voice shook at first, then steadied. He had witnessed the agreement in 1979. He remembered my father saying no committee would ever own his front porch. Then Sheriff Reeves confirmed the previous night's entry had been recorded, photographed, and documented. The cut chain. The contractor truck. Vivian's own words about site preparation. Vivian's face changed by inches, not all at once. First the smile vanished. Then the color faded under her makeup. Then her fingers tightened around the podium until the paper in front of her bent. She said, "The neighborhood voted." I looked at the deed, then at the rendering of my house turned into a community trophy. "The deed did not," I said. That was the moment Maple Ridge understood what Vivian had cost them. The Greenbelt Trail closed that afternoon. The picnic area behind the clubhouse was taped off by the county. The rear access lane was posted private property before sunset. Within 2 weeks, the board rescinded every notice, paid my legal fees, replaced my gate, and removed that ridiculous sign from my yard. Vivian resigned in a letter that used the word misunderstanding 4 times. I kept the sign. It hangs in my workshop now, above the bench where my father kept the blue tin box. That spring, I fixed the porch with cedar, straightened the mailbox, and left the old white oak exactly where my mother planted it. Neighbors started waving again. Some even apologized. I accepted, mostly. But every time I hear a committee talk like paper power is the same as ownership, I remember Vivian standing in my yard with her folder and her smile. They had votes, maps, letters, and a room full of raised hands. I had one old deed, one careful father, and enough patience to let the truth arrive on time.